you'd spent some time in LA and then you decided to open up the gallery here. What was either the biggest surprise or the biggest challenges that you faced off the bat?
It's a good question. It was really well received. I was happy about that. I guess maybe the most pleasant surprise was um, how quickly the gallery was embraced on an institutional level. We sold a major work that you are a big fan of by Ishiglitsky
Yeah.
to the Hammer from our second show. It was mind blowing, and we sold it directly. Like the Hammer bought it. It wasn't like a gift or nothing like that, and that was enormously rewarding and encouraging.
Welcome back to the MO podcast. This is Jonathan Neal. I am here with my co-host Joy Flores, and today we are thrilled to have Chris Sharp on the podcast. Chris is the founder and the director of Chris Sharp Gallery in Los Angeles, about which we're going to talk quite a bit. Chris is a well-known and respected curator and critic who has edited and written for a wide variety of magazines and publications. In full transparency, Chris and I were colleagues for a time at Art Review magazine as contributing editors. This is when I lived in New York City and Chris made his home in Paris, France. By 2013, Chris had moved to Mexico City and opened a small project space called Lulu in collaboration with the artist Martin Soto Clement, which became a very well-known and widely regarded project space in Mexico as the art world began to discover regions outside of the European and American centers. In 2017, Chris penned an influential essay, which I hope we'll talk a little bit about today too, in Moose magazine called Theory of the Minor, which offered a kind of encapsulation of what Lulu had been doing and put into words the critical position as to what kind of art being made today is worth our attention and support. In 2021, Lulu evolved to become an extension of the Beijing-based X Museum, and Chris shifted his time and attention to Los Angeles, where he opened his eponymous gallery and where he extended and evolved his ideas about the minor. The gallery has quickly established itself as a significant space and voice for an international roster of artists, which is no minor feat today. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Chris Sharp, to the MO podcast. Chris, welcome.
Hey, thanks for such a nice introduction, Jonathan.
No worries.
Great to be here.
So I think maybe to begin, give us just a little bit of a background of your sort of initial forays into the arts and the art.
Well, I guess I should start by saying that I have no qualifications whatsoever to do what I do, or at least no academic qualifications. I studied literature, mostly at the New School, and then later in France. I moved there and did junior year abroad, was studying mostly French literature. And while I was there, thought getting involved in art would be a viable way to make a living as a native English speaker in Paris. And so I started writing for different small publications. I did an internship at the French gallery, Aile de Paris, and I ended up working for an artist as his first full-time assistant, this artist Piotr Uklański. This was circa 2005. And then later, through a kind of elaborate picaresque accident, ended up curating my first show for this gallery, In Situ Fabien Leclerc, in 2006, and loved it. I thought I had such a great time. She sent me on an all-expense-paid trip to the U.S., New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, where I did some of my first studio visits. And I went back and I curated a show without really knowing anything about the history of art or, even the history of post-war art. And the show was something of a success that summer in Paris. And I loved the way it played with ideas of narrative in space. It was like a spatial representation or materialization, I guess, of narrative. Creating this narrative with works of art which already had their own narratives and so on and so forth. So I started to get really into that, and then I eventually got a job through equally picaresque circumstances as an editor of Flash Art in Milan, where I think I basically got paid to do a master's or the equivalent of a master's and just kind of learned. And then it, evolved from there. But I think, I just got really lucky. And anytime an opportunity came my way, I just kind of ran with it. Probably stupidly, like just stupid enough but also foolish enough to think I could do these things, even though I had no idea what I was doing, and then just kind of learning as I went. So that's maybe a start.
Yeah, it's a good start. What drove you then to leave Paris, leave Europe, leave the continent, and to go to Mexico City and open up this small gallery project space, which is not an unheard of thing for curators to do, but is definitely, I think, is a big move to have undertaken.
Uh, I wish I could respond to this question with like more intention and clarity, but again, it was kind of a series of circumstances. I I think when I moved to Mexico, I was in the process of moving to Berlin, and I for a number of reasons, I just thought it would be more interesting. I was kind of tired of Paris at the time. I'd been there for 8 years, and I just wanted like a change of scene. And I ended up doing an internship. I did a residency at a school in Mexico City, and I'd always wanted to go for a number of reasons. I mean, it was a combination of like, you know, like so many people being really um, interested and kind of almost fetishizing 90s Mexico City art, like early Gabriel Orozco and Francis Alice and things like that. And just this idea of like the post studio practice and working with the streets. And then also Mexican literature, like namely Bolaño. Bolaño was huge for me. I mean, when I read The Savage Detectives for the first time, it exacerbated my fascination with Mexico City, and the literary culture of Latin America has always like had a huge influence on me. Um, and so I did this residency, and I fell in love with the city. I mean, it's a really magical place. I mean, as most people know at this point, but at the time, it still felt, God, for lack of a better term, relatively exotic. There had already been like kind of generations of art professionals, and most notably like Melanie Smith, Francis Alice, Santiago Sierra, who's Spanish, who had kind of maybe colonized. That's such a terrible way of putting it, but like explored, and helped develop the scene and so on and so forth. But I was part of like I guess a second wave, or maybe even a third wave, who knows. And then I just decided to stay. I just fell in love with the place, and I thought, you know what, I can use this as a base. I was working mostly in Europe, so it was quite a commute. But in the end, it worked out. And then Martin and Martin had this extra room in his apartment, and he's like, "Why don't you stay with me?" I was in Mexico City, and I'd just come from Paris. And Paris, there were a couple spaces I should also acknowledge, um, which were also really influential for me. My friend Jason Huang and Roman Chenet opened a space called Chenene, which was really popular for a period. This was around 2012, and it was really eye opening. And there was another space called Castillo Corrales, which was actually before, and that was run by a group of artists like Oscar Tuazon and some curators. And they both had these incredible programs, which were some of the most influential programs in Paris at the time. And it was eye opening. It was just like, wow, they're doing this with nothing. Like these are more interesting than any institution in Paris. And they just made it happen. And then when I got to Mexico, I noticed that there was no Castillo Corrales or no Shenene. There was Curimanzuto, of course, Labor, House of Gaga, but there was nothing like this. Martin and I transformed our living room into a space, and then we just thought, you know what, let's try and create a space kind of like these other ones, with as little as possible. Like in the beginning, our website was just it was like a blog. You had to like scroll. There was no. I mean, it was. We didn't pay for anything. I think the only thing we paid for was the transformation of the living room into a white cube. We inserted literally a white cube into this living room, which was quite beautiful. That was mostly Martin's doing, but and then we would do shows with people where we would like Allison Katz and Camilla Wills. That was an early show. I think it was our third show. And we were like, hey, if you can pay for your plane ticket, we'll take care of you while you're here. And they did. And they made this incredible show. And we did everything. Like Martin helped. It was amazing. Martin helped Camilla and Allison develop paint out of cactus. As a base and things like that. And so it was just really on a shoestring budget, as it were. And then it was funny. It was like Lulu. It was, and we named it as well. The space. There was our local juicer where Martin and I used to go have breakfast almost every morning. This woman Lulu would make these fresh juices, and she would like make eggs and whatnot. And it was called Jugos y Licuados Lulu. And we made the space, and we're like, what are we going to call it? And I was there one morning, and I looked up, and I was like Lulu, and Martin was like, yes. And the most amazing thing about this, I love this. A couple of years later, I was in Europe working, and I needed to look something up on Google Maps, the image, because I wanted to see something in the neighborhood. And I went to Lulu, like the juicer on Google Images, and Martin and I were sitting in front of Lulu having breakfast. I mean, of course, our faces were blurred out, but it seemed like this kind of like sign from God. You know what I mean? It was like, oh my God. And then we preserved the image somewhere, but I'm sure it's changed many times since then. This was probably 2014 or 15. But yeah, it was just this. It was like, you know what? Let's get active in the scene. Martin himself, he was mostly, like many Mexican artists, working abroad, um, and not that active in Mexico. And I was new to Mexico City, and it was like this, maybe this is how we can contribute. And it was supposed to be this thing that we kind of did on the side, And I mean, our first show was Johann Lempert, who I think is one of the greatest living artists anywhere. And the program was, quickly became really ambitious. Nina Cannell had an amazing show there. I mean, Alison Katz again. I mean, so many. Michael E. Smith early on. Lucas Arruda had a show in early 2015. It was like one of his first international solo shows. I mean, it was, yeah, and it was all in this tiny little space, which was about 100 square feet large.
When you say it became ambitious, what does that mean to you? How do you think about it in terms of, going from this what was going to be a sort of side thing, project space, to something else in your mind and in your sensibility?
I think it wasn't my primary activity as an art professional, as a writer and a curator. My primary activities were curating shows, mostly again in Europe, writing a lot for different magazines at that point, mostly catalog texts. And Lulu was just supposed to be this thing that Martin and I kind of funded with our, extra money. And then it developed so much momentum so quickly. And of course it was about, I think a lot of it had to do with time and place. All of a sudden everybody became interested in Mexico, and there were other project spaces that opened at the same time, and there were a number of articles in the New York Times Art Review, like kind of every magazine and every publication. And there was just this buzz, and all of a sudden, it was like I myself, I'd always been an independent curator. I'd never had a job really, probably because I'm unemployable, but it became, this idea of developing a program was something I'd never experienced before. Before it was always like I would kind of parachute in, curate a show, and like kind of be airlifted out, never see the show again, and it would become part of some other program. And then I realized with Lulu, it was kind of like a linear group show, and I could really build a program, and it really mattered, you know. I mean, it's like in one of our first shows, we had this amazing piece by Willem de Roy, which was really hard for me to get. But then all of a sudden I realized, like, you know, you do a show with Willem de Roy in a project space in Mexico City, and this builds a kind of momentum where, like, I don't know, we did a beautiful show with Ian Kerr in the beginning. I mean, these are people who, you know, had been in the Venice Biennial and so on and so forth. It really started to punch above its weight as that, you know, it was like this tiny little space, which was, you know, operating with kind of radical economy, but at the same time, making waves. I mean, all over.
And
And
do you think that had to
good.
do with you, you know, having this, I think, pretty stellar reputation as a curator and writer in Europe. Martin being an artist, the idea that this is in Mexico, that the scale was small enough that it wasn't some sort of you know, immense commitment on the part of many of the artists, except for the sort of travel and getting there and kind of, you know,
Yeah.
beginning to establish this kind of outpost. But there was a sort of, you know, if you had to sort of chalk it up, what was the mix of sort of timing and circumstances that you think were sort of key to how it came together?
Well, I mean, I think Martin and I both came to it with a certain level of cultural capital. That's for sure. I mean, I had my profile and Martin had his profile. Um, and I think it's something that really captured people's imaginations, I think, was the scale, was the economy of it. You know, was like, this was a moment when, like, you know, every other week Gagosian was opening a new outpost, which was larger than the last in another city somewhere in the world. And it just felt like, I mean, I guess this is kind of intrinsic to the art world, but there was this kind of, how do you pronounce it? Hypertrophy? I think
Yep.
that's fair. Um, of growth in the art world. And our response was the exact opposite. It was like, actually, you know, you can make an impact with very little. You know, you can matter with, like, um, and I also think another thing that was really instrumental, and I absolutely have to acknowledge, right, the blogs, namely Contemporary Daily. Contemporary Daily was a huge supporter of Lulu, and that made a huge difference because I remember I would be on trips, work trips. I'd be in Japan, and I would introduce myself, and people would be like, "Lulu, Contemporary Daily," and I was like, you know, wow. I mean, so that's, I mean, that's, I think there's, I don't know, maybe it kind of gave people a kind of hope that you could matter and make an impact on the art world or in the discourse or the discussion, you know, with almost nothing. And I also think it was an interesting moment in contemporary art where, you know, to use Marxist terminology, where the means of production were kind of the means of communication. Like anyone, the means of production, the means of communication were kind of available to anyone. If you had a blog and internet and you could take decent photos, you know, because the thing is with Lulu, it's like I mean, the majority of our audience was international, it wasn't Mexico City. You know, I mean, sure, we'd have, I mean, people would come through, but like we, and this you could really criticize and fault us if you want. But I mean, the nature of the program was to kind of show art which had little or no exposure in Mexico City, which meant mostly international artists. And so, like, we weren't really involved in the local discussion, for better or for worse. We were involved in a more international discussion, and our audience was not necessarily local. Although, of course, it was, you know, every exhibition had to be great and look great, especially in person. But we also came to realize really quickly that like that's not our primary audience, and our primary audience is going to be experiencing Lulu through images for sure.
Mm.
So that was, and I think that was somehow paradigmatic of the moment as well. And Lulu was just kind of right, right at the crest of like that paradigm shift
That's interesting
in a
because
way.
so having this kind of almost a kind of, now that I think about it, the gallery as almost kind of photo studio, but in a center that was gaining a lot of interest and attention. Because I remember, I traveled to Mexico City a number of years in a row, but it was probably 2016, 17, 18, probably right around there. Um, and I think this was at the same moment as like Museo Jumex was kind of coming online, and there was a lot of tension to Eugenio Lopez and the kind of, this Curry Manzuto was becoming a more present member of the kind of international gallery consortium of blue chip
Yeah,
players. Um, and so it's not to say that Lulu was merely this kind of photo studio, but it's like being both part of that locality, but then also having this, um, making use of those tools of communication for a kind of international reach,
yeah,
is a very interesting mix.
yeah. And I mean, we weren't the only ones. I mean, there's
Sure.
Logos. There was a space called Bikini Wax. I'm not sure if it's still active. I mean, there were a number of spaces, and they benefited from um, these kind of, the internet essentially. And
Right.
I mean, that definitely brought a lot of attention to Mexico City.
I have this distinct recollection of running into you on the street in Mexico and being a visitor and a kind of tourist to Mexico City and really falling in love with the city, and you having been a resident there and been running this project space there for a number of years. And you kind of said to me, yeah, man, I'm thinking about leaving. Like, it's wearing me down. And me thinking to myself, like, oh, that's not the response that I expected. I expected everybody to kind of be in love with this city and the kind of the environment that it has. But I'm curious to ask you now. I remember we had a brief conversation about it, but what began to change your mind about Mexico City and about your time there, and began the process of you setting your eyes a little bit further north to Los Angeles.
Well, that's a big one, but I mean, my first couple of years there, I was incredibly happy. Um, yeah, I was very very happy. Lulu kind of wasn't a thing yet. It was just like this thing we were doing. Of course, I started to take it very seriously pretty early on, but I felt like uh, I mean, it's no matter how I say this, it's just going to sound naive, probably because it was. But I felt like I, when I first arrived in that first year or two, my existence wasn't necessarily political. I didn't have. I felt like I had no political impact um, on the city or the scene. I was somehow, I don't know how to put it, maybe like politic free or something. And uh, and the more embedded Lulu became in the scene, I think the more political became my existence. And that was a lot. That was like, I mean, it was something I was constantly negotiating. I mean, I was very aware of the fact that I was a gringo. And, as a gringo living in Mexico, you come with a certain amount of baggage. And it's totally understandable. I mean, Mexico has, for good reasons, is a pretty antagonistic relationship with the U.S. I mean, Latin America does. Totally get it. I mean, our relationship with Mexico and Latin America in general is largely one of exploitation. And and you just can't get away from that. And so running a space, you have to really down there. It's like you definitely, you don't want to show too many American artists, for example. That was something I was really conscious of. I was really conscious of uh, trying to make the program as global as possible. So it was like one show is maybe a German artist. We always showed one Latin American artist per year. So from Brazil, or I don't know, Argentina, or any Colombia, kind of anywhere, and then Mexico, of course, and it was just like this constant negotiation, and there was a lot of love for Lulu, and there was also a lot of antagonism. Um, Certain people were incredibly supportive. Jose and Monica, they bought a work from our first show, which is the first work of art I ever sold. Totally blew my mind. And they regularly came to see shows. And then there were certain people where like it didn't matter how many times you invited them. They never came ever. And I remember we did a show with Melanie Smith. I mean, she's English Mexican, naturalized Mexican citizen. She represented Mexico at the Venice Biennial. It was even hard to get people to see her show. And I don't know. I think at a certain point, it's like you just can't take anything for granted. As an art professional living abroad, I think, period, and then as an American living in Mexico, it's just this constant negotiation, um, and it just kind of wore me down. I mean, there was also we were just talking earlier. It's like you spend half your time on antibiotics, and that starts to wear you down as well. It really does. I mean, I remember I saw in my time in Mexico, I saw so many people come and be like, they found El Dorado, and I was like, they'll be gone in a year. And 9 out of 10 times I was right. You know, and it was true. I mean, that sounds awful, but yeah. But I think there was, and before Mexico, I was living in France or Europe for 10 years, and I had to negotiate similar conditions. As a foreigner, and I I was involved with a woman in LA. We actually had a long distance relationship going. When the pandemic happened, I was like, hey, I'll just spend a couple months. How long can this thing last, right? And at the end of a year, I opened a gallery. But there was also something really refreshing about not having to kind of consider all those different pressures as this kind of foreign agent, you know, in a different context. Granted, you open a gallery and there are other things that you don't even suspect. But I never had to, I like the idea. I mean, there's a lot of great American artists for whatever reason. That's a whole subject. But there's a shit ton of great American artists. I could do an entire program for like 5 years of just great American artists, and the shows would be amazing, and like that's something you don't have to think about in running a gallery in the US. It's just like not an issue, you know. No one's ever going to say, hey, you're showing too many Americans. What's wrong with you? Imperialist. Like it's just like not it's not going to happen. So
It's a great business idea. You could start the America First gallery.
right. I
Really,
mean,
really tap into a certain political strain in the U.S. currently.
I know it sounds very jingoistic. I don't mean it to. That's
No, I
that's
understand.
not my. But I mean,
Um,
here you deal with other pressures. So like,
so, what was the biggest surprise? I mean, when you decided, you'd spent some time in L.A. and then you decided to open up the gallery here. What was either the biggest surprise or the biggest challenges that you faced off the bat?
it's a good question. I mean, it was really well received. I was happy about that. I guess maybe the most pleasant surprise was um, how quickly the gallery was embraced on an institutional level. I mean, curators and institutional people came, which was not my experience in Mexico, at least not local. And of course, I had institutional people visit Lulu from all over the world, but not from Mexico. And here, yeah, I mean, we sold a major work that are a big fan of by Ishiglitsky
Yeah.
to The Hammer from our second show. It was mind blowing, like totally. And we sold it directly, like The Hammer bought it. It wasn't like a gift or nothing like that. And that was enormously rewarding and encouraging. It was like, yeah, it felt like we totally different from Lulu. I mean, Lulu,
What
I think in the entire 10 years of Lulu's existence, we made one institutional placement. And it was like by accident. But
do you have a theory about that? Why it happened fast here in Los Angeles?
I mean, I think it happened here quickly because, I mean, we're showing this great indigenous American artist who had no visibility whatsoever in LA at the right time. And I don't know, LA and the local institutions, I think they really support their own. I think that's a great thing. Um, and they take risks. And um, I think LA has a certain commitment to uh, LA artists, which sometimes can be kind of annoying, and other times it's like great. Like the institutions will buy and embrace these emerging positions for a variety of reasons. But it's not something you really see, or it's definitely not something I saw in Mexico.
Chris, was there a point at which Lulu went from being something that you were funding with side money to like something you would call a business, or was it always a sort of a sort of passion project?
It was definitely a passion project in the beginning. Um, I would say about halfway through. It lasted 10 years, and there was, um, God, I wonder, maybe around 2016 or 17. I mean, the whole idea behind the project, and this was, I mean, it's really complicated, but was to show artists who hadn't had much exposure in Mexico, um, but also to show artists whose politics were kind of inseparable from uh, the form and materials of the work. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but at the time in Mexico, it felt like um, virtually almost all contemporary art was, or a lot of contemporary art had, it had to demonstrate correct um, ideology. It had to be explicitly political, and a lot of the time it was all very conceptual or neo-conceptual. And I had the feeling a lot of the time that form was really secondary to content. Somebody was like, oh, this, I don't know, I don't want to name any names, but somebody, they're like, I don't know, there's some issue or something they wanted to discuss. They're like, I think I'll do it with painting. And I remember I was like, I was even on juries and things. And, and, and there were times when, somebody would use painting, and I would be like, this isn't painting. I don't know what you guys are talking about. And everybody else in the jury would be like, what are you talking about? That's a painting. And it's like, no, it's not. That's a conceptual artist who's using this as an idea or a vehicle to communicate some political stance or what have you. And so that really became a big part of Lulu's mission, is to like show artists like Elisa Nissenbaum, great Mexican American painter who is, now with very important, has been in many biennials. I mean, we did her first show. I think it was 2015. And here was somebody who was thinking, whose politics was indivisible from how she painted, um, how she used materials, how she depicted people, and was also very aware of the history of painting and art. And there was, I don't know, it was a very rich practice. And that seemed like, I was like, this is what I want to bring to the discussion, what I want to bring to the table. And then as that happened, I don't know, I guess I started, like, I remember we did Elisa's show. I think we sold one painting from the show to like a relative of hers. And then we did Nada Miami, the project space section. It was the first year. It was our first international fair. And we did the project booth section in the back of the fair. And I had Elisa Niesenbaum, figurative painter. This is December 2015, I guess. And at the time, everything else was process-based abstraction. It was like the final gasp of like zombie abstraction. I was the only person, and I shit you not, as impossible as this is to believe, I was the only person showing figurative painting at the fair. And by the end of the fair, like, people were ignoring us, but by the end of the fair, I'd sold out the booth, and Elisa's career had changed, and there were like 10 galleries who wanted to work with her. And it was, and I'm not going to say we're responsible for that change or shift, but we were part of it at the beginning. And then I think, and whoever bought those paintings is really smart, good for them. They cost like $4,000. It was nothing. I remember Elisa and I were so happy. I think we made 20 grand, or it was like crazy, where I was like giving them away. And I don't know. And I think, and then I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but I felt like, and at the time in Mexico, painting was seen as this kind of bourgeois art object par excellence, totally complicit with capitalism, devoid of political content, any kind of like discursive quality or what have you. And so I found myself pushing back against that more and more, and insisting that actually there was great painting that could be great in and of itself, while kind of dealing with political issues in a really interesting way. And Elisa was a great example of that. And so I found myself, and then along with that, I found myself, I realized I knew nothing about painting. I knew very little. And the more I spoke with painters, I just came to realize that this was a medium that was kind of inexhaustible. It was, it's the oldest medium in the history of humankind. And it's one of the things that it's almost impossible to do well, since its history is so saturated, but it continues to renew itself. And it's like bottomless, it's amazing. And so I found myself moving more and more towards painting, from a political stance as much as from a stance of like a student, like an amateur, the etymological term of that word, somebody who loves painting. And so we started introducing more and more artists to the market. Amber Wellman, I don't know, Elisa Niesenbaum. I mean, many positions, and so the gallery, and then we started being invited to more art fairs, and it became a more commercial enterprise. But it wasn't necessarily the mission of the gallery. Like the commercial aspect was kind of a consequence of this specific position. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question. But
No, it's interesting. I guess the reason I was asking that, is that I was just kind of wondering what your business experience was prior to launching Chris Sharp Gallery. I mean, would you say that, Lulu was an effective training ground for the Chris Sharp Gallery? And when you started the Chris Sharp Gallery, was that a business from day one? Or was that also something that you were doing out of passion and, kind of looking to see how it went? Or was it like, no, I'm going to start a business?
Yeah, I think it was, I'm going to start a business. I mean, my dream for Lulu was that it would last 10 years. Project spaces typically don't last more than a couple of years. And there was a lot of pressure throughout the years from art fairs and different people to transform it into a commercial gallery, which I considered many times. And I would even kind of like draw up a roster and so on and so forth. And then, but in the end, I wanted it to be this kind of ambiguous commercial space, which is also kind of like a little Kunsthal. And yeah, I learned a lot, like working in different art fairs. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes, and I still make tons of mistakes. But I recently turned 50, and I was like, I started Lulu. I guess I started Lulu. I was my late 30s, and it got to a point where like I didn't want to be a 50-year-old guy running a project space. I wanted to like create something that for better for worse, participated in a growth model. And I don't think you can't run a gallery if it doesn't make sense, especially if you're in a major center. I mean, you can't hope to run a successful gallery if you're not participating in the growth model, which is inextricable from capitalism. I mean, Lulu resisted the growth model for so long. And I remember there were so many fairs that were like, even Nada, they're like, you should get a bigger booth and demonstrate, let people know you're growing. And I remember at the time being like, no, that's not what we're doing. This isn't about growth, This is about doing as much as possible with as little as possible. The model is economic in every sense of the term. And I mean economic in the sense of, like a kind of like a perfect economy, like just doing as much as possible with as little as possible. And the gallery, yeah, it's different. You have to think in totally different terms.
I imagine having to sign a lease on a commercial space is probably the signature that tells you are now involved in a commercial operation rather than it being Martin's living room.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah, for sure.
Chris, when you talk about inevitably having to pursue a growth model, one of the questions I had thought about earlier is what is an exit strategy like for a gallerist such as yourself? Like, how do you think about? I mean, is this something that you just plan to do? And I don't, yeah, I won't tease it out anymore. Like, how do you think about the end game for the Chris Sharp Gallery?
The gallery is 3.5 years old, but I have to say I think about it more than I thought I would. Yeah, I mean, it's like running a gallery is, especially if you're prone to take yourself too seriously, which I am. It's an enormous amount. It's like 3 full-time jobs. I mean, it's insane, and the level of stress, and the way the economic model just multiplies. I mean, overnight, you're just like, I remember our first art fair with Lulu was like, our booth was $3,000, and it was like, whoa, Jesus, and now I get like $3,000 shipping bills, and I'm like, all right, that's not so bad, I mean, it's crazy, and just the way the expenditures just kind of multiply, exponentially. It's like you would never. And I talk to older dealers, and they're like, "Yeah, we did Art Basel. Our booth was $100,000," and it's like, and I know if I keep going, I'll be there. I don't know. I think it's really hard. I don't think you can be a gallerist forever and have a healthy lifestyle in any way. I mean, unless I don't know. I mean, most gallerists I know who have been at this, it's very hard to lead a balanced life. I do remember when I ran into Maxwell Graham soon after I opened the gallery, and what did he say? I knew Maxwell as a writer and a curator. Like, I've known him in like every incarnation of my art professional existence. And the first thing he said to me, he's like, Chris, as a gallerist, the one thing gallerists get to do that nobody else gets to do is they get to retire. Gallerists get to retire. And I was like, oh, interesting. So there is a possibility of retiring. But for the time being, I feel like there's still so much to do. I mean, I have so many artists who are just so incredible, and they just aren't where they should be. Their economy, their level of visibility. I mean, they still live mouth to mouth, month to month, hand to mouth, month to month, and that's just wrong.
Jonathan talks all the time about what a thoughtful gallerist you are. So I'm curious, what keeps you up at night the most? Is it just paying the lights and the rent, or are there artist career considerations that are more important to you? Like, what are the things that you worry about in running the gallery? In terms of maybe whether directly financial concerns, or are they invisible things that sort of you worry about a lot?
I mean, I think about everything. I mean, the one thing that consumes a lot of bandwidth is art fairs, for sure. Art fair model is yeah, you have to constantly strategize. But yeah, I'm constantly thinking about what I can do for my artists and how I can help them. You're like up at night and you're like, oh, I didn't invite that person to see the show. And they should really see it because, this aligns with their interests. And maybe it could lead to a review or a museum acquisition or what have you. Yeah, money is it's always scary for sure. I mean, because it's such a crazy model. It's not like it's like it rains or, you know, it somebody could be one of your biggest supporters and then they just disappear. I don't know. I'm amazed by these galleries who have like 20 people working for them. I mean, right now I have 2 people, maybe 3 people working for me. And even that, it's like, how fuck am I going to pay them? How does Kordinsky pay the 20 people who work for him? I mean, the pressure of that is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
when you've got $1 million canvases coming off the
yeah,
walls, it seems probably a little bit easier to make payroll every once in a while. But I'm sure that there's some times where
it,
things get tricky from cash flow. Yeah,
it 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 does, but you know what I mean. It's the craziest model. More money, more problems. I mean, it's
right,
you
right,
think there's no. I don't think any gallerist in the world is like I'm good. You know what I mean?
right,
I don't think they're ever like
right.
I made it to the top. I have the most expensive booth at Art Basel. I'm sure they're like, fuck, like how did I get here?
um, you mentioned a couple times. I want to dig into this a little bit. How do you think about strategizing the art fair piece of the business, and both from a commercial standpoint, but also from a curatorial standpoint? I mean, I think that there's, as you mentioned, that these fairs can put a lot of pressure on galleries and programs to expand, to take bigger positions at these various different outings. It's a huge expense, just logistics and time and energy on behalf of the gallerists, particularly the named gallerists who are there in order to maintain relationships with curators and collectors and the people who are important to sort of meet and greet and be on site with at these various different locales. Um, and I always sort of looked at it as the art fair was really an environment where the gallery was able to develop and maintain relationships with its client base, with collectors and institutions, and it's a kind of thing. And then the gallery was the place where it maintained its relationship with its artists, right? Where you put on these exhibitions and you're able to kind of showcase what it is that the artists are able to do. I'm curious if you have that kind of balance in your head when you're thinking about how the gallery operates, but I'm also more curious just to hear your thoughts on how the art fair model has both allowed you to do what it is that you do and also has created challenges for what it is that you want to be able to do as you move, let's say, into the next 3 to 5 years of the gallery's existence.
That's a good question. There's so much to respond to there. I guess I should say first of all, like right off the bat, like I like art fairs. A lot of people don't like art fairs, but I like art fairs for the simple reason you get thousands of people in front of the work. I mean, it's not the best possible conditions, but you get thousands of people. I mean, I do a show at my gallery and I'm lucky if I get 200 people to see the show during its 6-week run in LA. I mean, New York, it's different, right? You run a gallery in New York and your foot traffic is incredible. I mean, people really go see shows there. In LA, it's tough. I mean, Mexico City, whatever, it'd be 50 people would see a show. But you go to an art fair and it's like really there's something incredible about it, and you can change an artist's life. That said, I do think there's a big difference. I mean, I feel like the gallery is more for institutions. Like you remember Ishii's first show with the jacket. I
Yep.
mean, I wouldn't necessarily put that in the booth. That was a gallery show, or we recently did Lin May Said's and Johan Lempert. We did a show with them at the gallery, and that felt like a small Kunstverein show. It didn't feel like a gallery show, and it's not something you would present in a booth. So it's quite different. My approach towards fair is mostly solos because a lot of my artists are still emerging, and I think it's the best way to introduce an artist and develop an audience where they can see a lot of work in one space. And typically it seems to be the best commercial approach because like people tend to buy more. I think when they walk in a booth and they see 8 different artists and they don't know who they are, you're probably not going to sell very well. I mean, I think somebody like Regan Projects, they can do a booth with like 10 different artists because everybody knows the artists already, So it's not like they're doing something different. Yeah, I mean, I'm still, and I think something that not is maybe not so obvious, but different art fairs have different functions in different cities. Like you do Miami because you want to sell a lot, You do Arco Madrid because you want to connect with a largely Latin American client base, or curatoriat or what have you, because that's where the Latin Americans go. You do Art Basel because you want the street cred. I don't know. They all have, they have different functions. And for me, I'm always trying to figure out, like I've done independent a few times in New York, and independent has a very specific profile, which in some ways I really love. They really, I mean, thanks in large part to the one of the directors being Matthew Higgs, is like there's this real embrace of the idiosyncratic, which is something that's really important to my program. And I feel like I can introduce positions there like Altoon Sultan, or more recently we showed this artist Glenn Goldberg, who's this amazing, totally overlooked 70-year-old painter in New York. It's kind of hiding in plain sight, but totally incredible. And it's just weird. And it has this, it's just so strange and idiosyncratic and so unique that it doesn't kind of conform to any given contemporary category, and that's a big component of my program, those kind of unique positions. So for instance, and I'm not gonna do independent unless I have a position like that which makes sense for the context. So I think some dealers approach, they're like, I have to be in this fair just to like to make sure I'm still visible and relevant. And I understand that pressure, but I feel like that's a difficult pressure to negotiate economically. I mean, you want to be able to sell what you're showing as well,
Sure. What's your process of discovery here? And I want to tie in essay that I mentioned at the jump about the theory of the minor, because I think that also overlaps with this idea of that you just mentioned of the idiosyncratic, and the work that does not immediately conform to a kind of, let's say, recognizable or generic in the literary sensibility, right? Something that's not partaking of the, for lack of a better word, major flows of the contemporary art world. And so there's sort of 2 questions I have here. One, how do you yourself go about not recognizing it, but what's your process of discovery for artists who appeal to you and appeal to that sensibility of the minor, right? You just mentioned the artist that you had brought to independent, a 70-year-old hiding in plain sight in New York City, where if there are all these artists, if there are 5 years worth of shows of really excellent American painters in just sitting around out there, what is the mechanism that you yourself are using in a sense to try and to unearth those positions?
I mean, there's no formula. I mean, if there's any formula, it's artists. I always listen to artists. I talk to artists. I mean, this artist behind me, Tom Allen, is an artist I represent. He's in his late 40s. LA kind of staple. He teaches at Art Center. He's turned me on to many different artists, students of his. But then there are other times when, like, this guy, Glenn Goldberg, one of my artists, Anna Glantz, was like, Chris, check this out. And then I looked at it, and then I ended up at a dinner for Merlin James in New York, and Glenn was at the dinner. And I was like, all right, I got to follow up on this. And I ended up in his studio. It blew my mind. I was like, this is the best thing I've seen in ages. I remember it was Mickey Schubert, this older German dealer. She closed probably 10 years ago in Berlin. She had a great program, but she told me, she's like, I only listen to artists. And I was like, that's good advice. Although it's not necessarily the case for me. I mean, I'll listen to anything. I'm always looking, and sometimes I'll find an artist and nobody in my program, including Tom, will like it, and I'll show it anyways. and I mean, I try and trust my instincts. But I definitely, I feel like the past 5 years has been totally dominated by, the trend has been identity. The more marginal, the better. And I feel like that's in any discussion of art always starts, for the past 5 years, it started with identity. And that's not, for me, it's not I mean, it is a criterion because I'm not stupid, but it's definitely, I'm not going to show somebody based on their identity. I'm going to show
Sure.
them because the work is great. Like Ishi, for example,
Yeah.
is, could be considered identitarian position, but the work is amazing, and in 5 years, it'll still be amazing when people aren't talking about indigenous art anymore, or they're talking about some other thing. And that's what it comes down to. So that's,
How
but
do
at
you
the same time, good.
So I was going to say, how do you then, let's say, in a conversation with a curator or a collector at an art fair, at the gallery, how do you find yourself negotiating this understanding that you have about the politics of form and the way that is made evident by artists who have really dedicated themselves to a kind of practice and have really, the way I always think about it, who have kind of passed through the looking glass of their own activities and come out the other side in a kind of transformed way. But it's very difficult for a regular visitor to an exhibition to be able to travel that path with the artist. And so the gallery is responsible for creating a narrative or a story about what this work is that is in a way immediately accessible. And if there's one thing that the politics of identity of the last 5 years has done, it makes those stories very quick and very easy to digest, right? If there's anything more commercial, more saleable, it's the very quick and specific way that a biographical snippet can become a sales tool. Whereas
Yeah,
asking someone to engage with the work at a level of kind of formal nuance, which I think was, is something that we've seen various different practices and moments in the history of art do and, and take seriously, but it's required a kind of translation, a real effort of translation. How do you find yourself navigating that in a kind of sales situation? Or is it more that people show up and they either get it and they don't, and you're okay with that?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of a combination, but I mean, I've had collectors come in and they're like, so what is he? You know, that's the first question. But I just do what I've always done, and I share with people, or even you when you come into the gallery. I tell you why I think this is great. And some people are more receptive to that than others. Some people might come in and you feel like they just don't like it, they're totally shut down. But if somebody is open or they want to learn more or discuss it, I mean, I'm not going to shove it down their throats, but I think that's the best thing a dealer can do. I mean, dealers have different ways of operating. I have friends who they're like, the Rubels bought one. That's their whole strategy. And then it's crazy. But for
Yeah.
me, it's like, I mean, you've seen me in action many times, and I always enjoy our visits because I know you're going to engage.
Yeah.
And somebody like Jonathan Griffin, he'll come. He'll even be like, or other people, or sometimes collectors. And they're like, I don't really get this, Chris. Or I had an Italian collector recently at this fair in Basel, and he was like, I'm not convinced. And I was like, all right, you're wrong. And then I I explained why I think this work is great, and that's all you can do. And I don't know, but my for the time being, my position isn't necessarily selling people something they don't want. It's not. But I hope most of the time that I can get them understand or get on board with me, why it's so great.
What do you look for, Chris? What's great for you? I mean, or for the Chris Sharp Gallery?
I'm really interested in people and artists who are doing something I've never seen before, or doing it their way. They're developing their own specific languages. That's nothing gets me more is when I feel like I mean, I guess in this sense, I'm really a modernist, I'm like, I was raised on Joyce. You don't go to Joyce. I mean, you have to learn Joyce's language. You have to learn Beckett's language. And I love artists who can do that. I love Ishii. Every time Ishii does something, it's like, I don't know, he develops a specific technique and language, and formalizes ideas. Or somebody like Angeline Rivas, who Jonathan appreciates. It's this artist I came to through Tom. I actually taught with Tom. And I remember when I first saw it, I was like, I don't know. And then Tom's like, you got to go to her studio. And this woman, it's incredible. I mean, she manages to do something formally with airbrush painting, which I'm not even particularly fond of, which I've never seen before. And in doing so, I mean, on a formal level, but also at the same time, somehow encapsulate the entire history of the entire kind of, let's say, spiritual history of California, and by extension, the West and even the US, as just this place of crackpots and weirdos and dreamers. And I mean, it's amazing. I love when people can do that. I mean, I love world builders. World building is pretty important to me. That's something I think a lot of artists in the gallery have in common, that they're really, it's like you enter their universe, and it is this kind of transformative experience. And yeah, the idiosyncratic. I mean, I guess that's the idiosyncratic in a nutshell, is that somebody invents their own language, which you have to submit to and learn. But it's always, it's important. It's not some narcissistic or solipsistic experience on their part. It's something that transcends them, taps into something greater. So yeah, that's generally what I'm looking for.
It's a good articulation, I think, of your essay and your sensibility of the theory of the minor, right? Of this access to something that is larger than oneself, something that taps into the culture, into history, into something that is beyond the individual, but it can only happen through a highly developed sense of the kind of the individualistic, right? Of
Yeah,
the and it doesn't that's not about the cultivation of the self, which is where identity takes you. It's like a sort of cultivation of a practice of a kind of submission to material, a submission to a a way of making worlds for oneself that then others are able to sort of catch a glimpse of that larger, all the other forces that are acting upon that sensibility, and opens up a little bit of a window into it.
yeah. It's so it's so challenging because like I felt like some of the pressures that I really resisted and helped me kind of form or articulate this what is largely an oppositional stance are taking place in Mexico, where there was this kind of implicit obligation to reportage. You know what I mean? Like the news, like somehow. Um, and for me, that's not where art lives at all. It's like that does you just read the news, like that's not art. Art is so much richer and more complex and like I don't know, challenging and fulfilling. And I don't know, I feel like art is um it's kind of human beings at their best, which doesn't mean that artists are good people. I don't necessarily think that. I think that's crazy. This our kind of the moral panic of our moment, where everybody has to be this great, um, morally correct person. Which is not to say that I mean, you don't want to work with terrible people, but for me, I don't know. I just think like it's being a human being is such a fundamentally incomprehensible experience and I think artists come along and I don't know, they somehow they manage to distill the best of what human beings can be into this thing, which um, creates this kind of glimmer of clarity or comprehension, or like, oh yeah, that, you know, that's why I don't know. I fight through traffic every day or whatever. It's like there's I don't know. It, and at the same time, it's somehow transcendental. You know, it's that's what I'm interested in. Not interested in the news. Not interested in whatever.
So we have a few questions that we'd like to ask all of our guests. Usually towards the end of the podcast, we call this the more opinions segment of the MO podcast. It'll be a little bit less heady than the conversation we just had, but maybe it'll tend towards some interesting areas. Um, so one question we always like to ask people is what's a enterprise, another business or activity or project that somebody else is doing currently that you really admire. And for you, I'm going to exclude you being able to say any of your artists that you represent, because we won't just do sheer sheer marketing. So you've got to choose something beyond the scope of the gallery and your own enterprise, but something you've seen, an exhibition, a project, an enterprise of something that's caught your attention, that you admire, and that you would draw other people's attention.
I mean, I would say one of my colleagues, the gallery in LA, Nonaka Hill, and I think Nonaka Hill it's a brilliant gallery, and um, it's a couple, Japanese American couple, who show almost exclusively Japanese artists. And when they first opened, I was like, this will never fly in LA because LA is so self-regarding, you know. But I think they opened at the right time and place, and I think it's funny. It's very insightful. They provide a relief from these kind of constant questions of identity, sexual orientation, and whatnot, because they're just showing Japanese artists. So it's like they bracket all of that political whatever, and they're just like, because you're like, and the most amazing thing is like it's never part of the discussion. The discussion is always about the work, and I think it's a brilliant kind of response to our moment. It's like, I mean, every time I go, Rodney, he'll talk your ear off for like an hour, but he'll be like, "This is how this ceramic is made, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen." And you're I mean, it's not to say that he's dismissive of historical conditions or even the historical conditions of Japan. He's very cognizant of all of that. But in the end, you're always talking about the work. And I think I love that about his project. And I love that he found a way to get away with that, when we're in this moment where nobody's talking about the work.
That's a good recommendation. The other thing that I love about Nonaka Hill is that the gallery is in the most strip malls that one can imagine, and it feels like the
Yeah.
most essential LA approach to drive into, what would otherwise be housing like a chicken joint, a frozen yogurt stand, like a laundromat, and then there's this this great sort of glass fronted white box exhibition space. It's great. It's
Yeah.
a that
Yeah.
itself is idiosyncratic.
Like right next to a donut shop.
Right.
It's amazing. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
If you had a budget of $10 million, what new enterprise would you begin?
God, I mean, collect like I wanted to collect. I don't know if that's an enterprise. I mean, there are professional collectors, but I don't think there's anything else. God, I don't know. Maybe open a bookstore, like a small beachside town. That's probably that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Follow up on that. What are you reading right now?
I am reading Beckett's Malloy, which I've never read. I'm ashamed to say. I love Beckett. I'm pretty familiar with his theatrical works. I've even seen a number of them. I saw Waiting for Godot in French when I lived there as a student and all this stuff. But I was at this dinner recently in Basel and Beckett came up and everyone was talking about their favorite Beckett. And mine is Craps Last Tape, which is an early one-act play. And then a couple different people are like Malloy. And I was in a bookstore recently in Paris and I just picked it up. And he wrote it in French. This sounds pretentious, but whatever, fuck it. He wrote it in French, so I was like, I'm going to read it in French. And it's hard. It's hard to read in French because he had an incredible vocabulary. It's also pretty classic. It's like it was written, I think, in 47. So it's like there's a lot of older words, but it's amazing. It's like, I mean, the first day that I sat down and read it, I was like laughing for hours. Like I was at the gym laughing to myself about Beckett, and it's a wonderful book, and it's difficult though, so I'm like reading it slowly, really really enjoying it. I mean, Beckett is timeless.
All right, last question in our more opinion segment. If you could steal one work of art from a major institution, what work of art would you steal to live with?
Terrible. The first thing that comes to mind is probably wouldn't be my first choice, but this work, which somehow was always very important to me, it's this early Gabriel Orozco photograph. It's from 1993, and it's called Breath on Piano. We showed it at Lulu, actually. We did these Lulennials, these kind of fake biennials. And the first Lulennial, I got this piece. The first Lulennial was called A Slight Gesture, so it was all about economy of gesture. And this early Gabriel Orozco photograph, it's literally breath on a black piano. And it's like taken from an angle, and you see the kind of the fog of somebody having just breathed on the piano. And the photo is very beautiful. It's formally, gorgeous. And I think it's a perfect representation of economy, of economy of art making. And then also, it's also this really beautiful representation of Duchamp's idea of the inframince. It's called, in English, it's translated as the infrathin. And Duchamp, it's like this kind of proto-conceptual. He defined it as this kind of almost uncapturable instance And one of his definitions was the warmth, the energy of somebody who just makes it through the subway or the metro doors, and the doors close, and there's that slight energy which remains, or the warmth on the door. For him, that was infamous. And I
Hmm.
think this photo with the breath on the piano is it's infamous, you know.
Yeah.
So it's beautiful and economic, and it somehow encapsulates, I think, whole histories of art with almost, with so little. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But after that, I don't know. Maybe it would be a Lucas Arruda painting. I'm not sure. But yeah,
Chris,
this
thank you very much for joining us. Those are great conversation, great answers, and I really appreciate the attention and the insight.
You're welcome. Thanks for the great questions and for inviting me to have this conversation and reflect on what I do. Appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you, Chris.